Once again, today we'll talk about GraphQL. I'll explain what is it, and we'll write some code using our GraphQL API. So whenever you build any system, you need to somehow interact with it. And typically interactions are created using APIs. But for every API, you need an architecture. So API architecture, I don't know how to spell that word, but API architecture. And you can go with many possible solutions to that problem. So you can use REST, you can use gRPC from Google, you can use, I don't know, even SOAP. Well, SOAP is a protocol, but still you can use it to describe your APIs. And whenever we build any system, we may want to use, or we may want to see or take a look at GraphQL. So GraphQL API or GraphQL system, it's better to say it like that, is a special API that allows you, and special runtime API and data relations that allow you to really build very sophisticated and very beautiful APIs using special languages, using special tools. So once again, API is the way you talk to your system. So API is how you really interact with your system. And typically we interact using some kind of HTTP calls. So that is like the most common way nowadays. So almost every application uses some kind of HTTP. And yeah, API, you can have REST with HTTP or you can have GraphQL with HTTP. Those are the most two popular ideas right now. REST is much popular, but GraphQL is kind of new. It's only like 8 years old. No, 9 years old. We are in 2021. Actually 10 years old if we're counting that I'm recording that video in December. So yeah, GraphQL is very, very new. And because of that, let's just dive deep into it. So the first idea that we're going to talk about is types. So type in GraphQL is like a representation of your database object. So in that case, I'll create type user that has ID and username. So type user, imagine that in my database, I have a table, a document, if you're talking about document or in databases, I know, key, well, graph node, if you're talking about graph databases or other stuff. And in that case, I have the name of my type, which is user. Or if you worked with TypeScript before, then you know what type is. So type user. Okay, the next thing that we should do is show our types. So the idea is kind of like that, field and then field type. In our case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create ID, type of ID, and then username, type of string, like that. There are tons of types in GraphQL, and if you want me to make a separate video on that, then, or a video where we are going to talk about depth details of GraphQL, then just write it down in the comments. Also, what we need to do is create our type object, or sorry, type query. So type query is the most general query that you ever have. So queries, all the requests, all the queries of your API go here. So all of the queries for the data. It's very, very important. So whenever you write something that will update the data, delete the data, insert new data, so save new data, it's not going to be in query. It's going to be in type mutation. But query is like all of your GET requests. So whenever you want to retrieve some data from your API, you use query. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply use my query. So I'm going to write my queries here. So in our case, it's going to be get user query. And what we can do is we can put some parentheses here in order to have some, I don't know, ID, have some arguments in our get user query. But since I'm not going to discuss arguments today, I'm just going to put get user, colon, and the return type of my user. So user like that. So once again, that is the query. Typically, the queries go like that. So query name, then parentheses, query arguments, so arg and arg type, and then you have return type like that. So that is the common idea of queries in GraphQL. So we have get user right now and we can execute it. But before we do that, what we need to do is actually we need to go to Python, because we're going to talk about GraphQL in Python. So I'm not going to build any API today, but I'm just going to show you how you can interact with GraphQL. And if you're interested in GraphQL and all of that stuff, then I'm going to make other videos. So Graphene is the library that we're going to install, and that library will help us to work with the GraphQL. So it's very, very important to understand that GraphQL is not only the markup language. So that's all is used in GraphQL. But apart from that, we need to parse those queries, we need to put data, so we need to connect the data, relate the data with our queries. And yeah, that's very, very important. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to install Graphene. Graphene is a library for Python that literally works with GraphQL. So Graphene, GraphQL, very, very easy. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rewrite those types in my Python, because those types are in my GQL or GraphQL schema file. And if I want to work with them in Python, then what I'm going to do is just simply going to use class user, then put parentheses, graphene, object type. So it's literally the same. So we're creating class user instead of type, because we don't have types in Python. Well, we have them, but not in that manner. So we are creating class user, which inherits from graphene object type. And object type is like the type prefix here. So yeah, you're literally saying that your user is an object. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two fields. First of all, ID, which is going to be graphene.id, and username, which is going to be graphene.string. So that's basically the same as you would write it in schema or in GQL files in GraphQL markup language. And yeah, another important idea is that when we write type queries, we would write them as it's a normal object. So as you can see, I don't have any like query, or I don't have anything else. I just literally have type here. So type, and the name is query. The same goes for Python. So we're going to create our query, graphene.query, or sorry, object type. Yeah, so queries are just normal objects that have queries inside of them. So once again, it's very important to understand the ideas. User is the entity of your GraphQL. Query is also an entity, but query represents all of the queries that are coming inside of your GraphQL. So in our case, query will not have any, well, it can have fields, but I'll write queries here. So typically you only write your queries inside of your query object type. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to use query or graphene field, which has user inside of it. So get user is going to be graphene field from user. So what does that mean? That means literally the same as it is here. So get user query is the query that returns graphene field from user. So my get user query returns my user as the result. But we haven't really written any code that will get the users from the database, that will, I don't know, sanitize those users or do some kind of calculations, evaluations, and so on. So we haven't written our code yet. And because of that, we need to write our resolvers. So what is a resolver? Resolve get user. Resolver in GraphQL, let me just put root and info here. Resolver in GraphQL, it's a special function. Typically, it's a static method. So I like to use them as static methods because it's easier to work with the arguments in that function. So resolver is a special function that will actually get your query, will parse that query, and will return something as the result. So as you can see, our query is named getUser, and the resolver for that getUser is literally resolve and then the name of the query. So if I would call my query, I don't know, ABC, then to resolve that query, I would create a function, typically a static method. You can omit it, but I create a static method, and I would name it resolve ABC. But in our case, we have getUser as the name, so getUser here. So root and info arguments are the arguments that you are using to interact with the user. So as I said, then when you create a function, when you create a query, what you can do is get many users, like that. You can put variables inside of here. So a as I don't know, a string, for example. And because of that, we can have some context, some variables inside of those root and info variables. But I will not work with them today because, yeah, that's just an introduction to GraphQL. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new user, which is going to be user. New user ID is going to be 0, and new user username is going to be Andrew. Then I'm going to return that user, new user. Okay, so that is the whole code that we are going to write in order to translate that GraphQL schema into Python. So once again, let's repeat everything. So let's revise everything or whatever. We import Graphene library to work with GraphQL. We create our class user, which is an object type, and that user represents our data. So it's kind of like a serializer for our data. So an entity, it represents an entity. Then, yeah, it has fields like ID, Graphene ID, and username string, and then we create our query. Query is a special type, so a special class in our case, that will contain all of the queries for our user. Not only for user, but all of our queries, like for the whole API. So if you have, I don't know, like shopping, if you like shops, payments, I don't know, and other authentication systems apart from users, then all the queries are gonna be located inside of that query. Of course, you have inheritance and stuff with the query, but I will not show it today. So what you need to think about is that all of the queries end up in that class query. That's the only thing that you need to consider when you work with your GraphQL APIs. Okay, and then we inherit from Graphene object type and we create our first query, which is get_user. So that is the name of our query. I'm saying that graphene.field equals user, so Graphene will return me a field of type user, so our query getUser, at the end will return us a user. And then I'm saying that I have resolve getUser, so that is a resolver for our user. I create a new user, I'm saying that its ID is 0 and its username is Andrew. And then I return him as a result. What we're going to do now? Now we're going to create a schema. So in our case, we don't even need that GraphQL anymore, because now we're going to create our schema. So what is schema? We have queries. We always have queries, but we also need a schema. Schema is like the thing that really executes all of your queries. So in our case, it's going to be Graphene schema. And as you can see, you have, I don't know, you have some things in here. First of all, you have query, then you have mutation, then you have subscription, then you have types and so on, directives. And those things are very, very important because schema is kind of the endpoint for your API. So all of the queries will go to the schema. I said that all the queries will go to the query, and that's right, because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say query equals query, like that. But also, apart from the queries, you have mutations, because you should never forget that when you work with your schema, you have queries, and queries, so class query, that class that we just created, is only used to retrieve the data. But when you want to update the data, you need to use mutations. And yeah, but I will not talk about them today. Once again, if you want me to make an in-depth video, then just write it down in the comments. Yeah, that video is kind of like an overview of GraphQL. So we created a schema, and schema is like the endpoint itself. So query is where all of your queries are located, but schema is the API endpoint itself. And let's create results variable, and we'll execute query here. So schema execute. I'll put a string here, and now we need to write our real query. So our real query is going to be like that, query. So we want to query some information from our database. So not from the database, but from the API. In our case, the only query that we can put is our getUser. So in our case, it's going to be get and user in the camel case. That's very, very important because GraphQL works with the frontend with JavaScript, and because of that, everything is translated to a camel case. You can remove that, but typically it's better to put everything in camel case for the GraphQL. Okay, so get user in camel case, even though once again we wrote it as get_user, it's always translated to a camel case. And after that, what we're going to do is use ID, name, or sorry, ID, username. I think it's username, right? Yeah, username. So what I'm saying here, I'm saying that you need to query, so you need to query some queries. Yeah, the query that you're gonna query is getUser, and you're going to get ID and username of that user, so of the results of that query. Let's print the results, print results data. Let's run it. And as you can see, get user, ID 0, username Andrew. So what does that mean? That means that GraphQL returned that user that we created right here. But why do we care about that? We care about that because GraphQL solves one of the biggest problems in REST APIs. So if you work with REST, you know that in REST, what you have is, if you want to query users, then you're just saying backend, so backend.com/users, and you query all the users. If you want to query the first user, you're saying users/1, or user ID of the user, like that. But with GraphQL, what you can do is, you can have one API, so in our case, it's going to be, as you can see here, we have different endpoints, not APIs, but endpoints. So for users, for all of the users, we're going to use users. For products, we're going to use products, and so on. But with GraphQL, we only use GraphQL API. So GraphQL, or whatever you like to call it. So there is only one URL. But the difference is that whenever we send our queries, as you can see, we receive ID and username. But if I want to change my query, so if I want to only receive ID, I do not need to write any additional code. The only thing that I need to do is literally remove the fields that are unnecessary to me. ID 0. So in that manner, what you can do is you can write some queries for your front-end application as an API developer, and then your front-end team will just query the same queries and receive different results because of the fields that they can put in those queries or they can omit. And yeah, that's very, very important, because now what I can do is, if I want a username, I can use username here, and it will be beneficial for me because I only receive username. I do not receive any additional information. That is very, very important, because with REST, when you have like APIs users one, you typically receive the whole entity, the whole user, and that is not great at all, because like, yeah, you can do it better. And with GraphQL, what is better is that you can only query the fields that you really need. That is one of the additions to today's video. And yeah, that is the query that helped us to get our user. So literally like that. Yeah, ID, username. If we want to get every field, of course we can get every field if we want to, but typically we only get the fields that are necessary for our application. That is the whole video. So that was an introduction to GraphQL. It's very, very basic, very, very easy to understand. So it's really like the overview, the introduction to that system. And if you want me to make other videos, so for example, to how to connect that GraphQL to Django, or how to do other stuff with GraphQL, then just write that down in the comments. So thank you for the watching. I will see you in the next video, and good luck.